All right, welcome to your first set of video notes on birds. So this set is going to focus on the evolutionary history of birds as well as some of their important external structures and the mechanisms of flight. So first, let's just talk about the major characteristics of birds in general. So they have adaptations for flight. Obviously, you know birds fly. They have feathers. They're endothermic. They have a very high metabolic rate, which relates back to their ability to fly. They have a vertebral column modified for flight, and they have lightened bones. Also, modern birds do not have teeth. Instead, they have some sort of bill. So birds actually descended from an ancient archosaurs, and this is actually shared by dinosaurs and crocodiles as well. So there's a lot of close relationships in terms of birds and reptiles. So some of the anatomical similarities, they have that single occipital condyle on their skull, which allows more of that rotation of the head, a single ear ossicle, and the lower jaw structure. There's also nucleated red blood cells and liver and kidney function in birds that are related to these reptiles. And then behaviorally, they also have nesting and care of young, which you don't always see in amphibians and fish and some reptiles. So here's a potential theory in terms of the sequence in the evolution of flight in general. So birds started by jumping from branch to branch, then moving from branch to ground, then eventually gliding evolved, followed by weak flapping, and then eventually wing-powered flight evolved. When we look at modern birds, adaptive radiation, that's a topic of evolution in terms of one species resulting in many species. So this has ultimately resulted in about 9,100 species of living birds and 27 orders. We will not get into the orders when we talk about birds, but there are many orders of them. So they have specific features about them. So they have specific behaviors, songs, anatomical differences, and all those different ecological niches that help them distinguish between each other. So every body system of a bird is going to show some adaptation for flight. They are one of, besides other than bats, most other vertebrates cannot fly. So they have a lot of different adaptations to make that possible. So they're endothermic, which means they create their own temperature. Feathers, great senses, their necks are flexible, and they have lightweight bones, among other things. When we talk about the external structure, so the term plumage is used to describe the covering of feathers on a bird. So there's two functions of plumage. One, obviously, form the flight surfaces, but two is to prevent that heat loss, which gives them that endothermic ability. So mammals have fur, birds have feathers to keep themselves warm. But feathers are also important in some other minor functions like courtship, incubation when they're sitting on eggs, and keeping them dry when it's raining. The feathers themselves develop in a fashion that's actually similar to the scales of reptiles, which is another important concept to demonstrate that tie in terms of evolution between reptiles and birds. So only the inner pulp of the feathers has the dermal elements, and then as those feathers mature, their blood supply is cut off and the feather actually becomes dead and keratinized. So here's just a closer look at how feathers are formed. You may want to pause this here and look at this in more detail, but it shows the formation. So you start here, and then eventually the follicle forms, which then starts forming those ridges where the feathers start forming to where eventually you have that feather. So there are three types of feathers we're going to focus on in this class, and that's contour feathers, down feathers, and flight feathers. Contour feathers cover the body, wings, and tail. So these are the feathers are the most numerous in the bird, and I'm sure you've seen feathers like this before, even like arts and craft feathers look like this. Down feathers are the insulating feathers, and these are underneath the contour feathers, and this helps insulation, especially like baby birds, for example, have a lot of down feathers. They don't have those contour feathers yet, so it definitely helps keep them warm. And finally, flight feathers. So these line the tip and trailing edge of wings. As you can see, there's shorter ones, and then there's the longer ones. All of these feathers, though, help in flight. So to keep their feathers looking pretty, birds have to do a lot of maintenance. So they do something called preening, and this is done by they rub their bill over their feathers. If you've watched birds for any amount of time, I'm sure you've seen this happen. And this helps just keep the feathers smooth, clean, in the right place. Sometimes the feathers get like twisted or rotated out of place, and birds will actually like clean them and rearrange them with their beaks. There's also secretions from something called a uropygial gland, which is at the base of their tail, and this is kind of what they spread all over their body. So it's kind of like this oil, and they put their beak by their tail, and then they clean all their feathers with it to keep their feathers water repellent. Feather colors are also something that's pretty cool. So most of the colors are from pigments, and these are deposited in the feather during formation. But there's also structural colors due to irregular formation and results in those reflective iridescent type feathers. And this is actually an irregularity, which is causing that blue light to be reflected and the other colors of white light to go into the barb. So obviously with feathers and the maintenance comes molting. So in reptiles, we use a term called ecdysis, but in birds, we use the term called molting. And this is just the process of simply shedding and replacing feathers that are worn. If you've ever seen kind of livestock like chickens, they go through a molting process usually in the fall, and they look kind of like patchy and they have little naked spots, but that's just them shedding their feathers and getting new ones. They also stop laying eggs as much during that period. So in terms of molting pattern, a bird, like we talked about, is going to hatch with downy feathers to stay warm. As they grow, those juvenile feathers grow and they molt the downy feathers. And then once they reach sexual maturity, they molt again before breeding season, and then they'll do a post-nuptial molt in the fall. So in terms of thermal regulation then, birds have to keep their body temperatures at a pretty steady rate, so between 38 and 45 degrees Celsius. On cold days, you've probably seen birds that look like this down here. They get all fluffy and they tuck their bills, and they're using countercurrent heat exchange, and they kind of shiver to keep themselves warm. So the mechanics of bird flight, if you know anything about airplanes and how wings on a plane work, it's kind of similar. So the bird's wings act as an airfoil, and this provides lift because the currents move through it and lift the bird as it goes. So it means that the anterior or the front margin of the wing is thicker than the posterior margin, and this helps with that lift. So here's just a look at the airflow. So you see here's a plane down here versus a bird wing, and you see how it's broader here and narrower at the end, and that's what causes that lift. So increasing the angle of attack can also increase the lift, but this causes some turbulence, even with birds. So there's a structure called the allula, which reduces turbulence, and this is just a small group of feathers that you see in this picture here, and it helps during takeoff, landing, and hovering flight, which causes the angle of attack to increase, and then it gets lifted. During soaring flight, it gets reduced to help keep that same angle of attack decreased. So the tail is also a very important structure of a bird, and this is really, really important for balancing, steering, and braking during flight. Now there's 4 types of flight that we're also going to get into. So gliding, flapping, soaring, and hovering. So flapping flight, this is used by waterfowl as they're coming in for a landing. The wings are pretty stationary, and then the bird's just simply losing altitude. In gliding flight, the wings are going to generate power for flight, and this is the most common. This is what you see by most birds as they're flying. They're not flying really, really hard to get away from something, but they do have to do some sort of maintenance. Soaring flight is typically used by hawks and vultures, especially when they're frequently seen like circling above the sky. And the wings here are essentially stationary. So the bird's going to use updrafts and currents to gain altitude or lose altitude, but they really don't move their wings at all when they soar. And finally, hovering flight. So this is used primarily by hummingbirds, and it's as they're feeding from a flower. If you've ever had hummingbird feeders outside your window, you see how they move very, very fast with their wings. Sometimes they will stop, but usually they just hover and take the nectar out. So they actually can fan their wings 50 to 88 beats per second, and those wings are going to move in a figure 8 pattern to obtain lift from both sides of the wing. In terms of migration, birds typically make periodic round trips. Now, not all birds migrate, but a lot of them do, and it's usually an annual thing. So they move north and for nesting and reproduction, and then in the winter, when it's cold in the north, they move south. And this allows them to avoid those climatic extremes, but also to make sure they have plenty of food and shelter and space to live. They do migrate in response to certain physiological conditions. So there's a photoperiod that is their cue. So when the days start getting shorter, their reproductive organs shrink and they start storing fat, and this means they're going to migrate south. Then, as the days start becoming longer, they increase their development for reproduction and they start storing fat again, but this time to migrate north. And then once they get there, that's when they'll start reproducing. And in terms of navigation, it's kind of crazy how they can go to the exact same place every single year and know exactly how to get there. So they use both route-based and location-based navigation. So route-based is just as you would expect. They use landmarks. They're used to passing certain things, and that's what they use to navigate. Location-based navigation uses different things. So they use magnetic fields, sun compass, and even celestial cues. And if you kind of look here at this picture, you can see day versus night and how they know they're going north versus south. And that is it for your first set of notes.